We've essentially come together to talk about how our unexamined fears play a massive role in our reactive behavior and in all our behaviors. And as you know, fear is one of my absolute favorite subjects. I like to joke that I'm an expert on fear because of the fact that I have been afraid for such a large portion of my life and have lived in a deep state of fear. And in trying to solve my own fears and anxieties and panics and seizures, and I feel like she has become one of my greatest teachers. It's very interesting to note that even if you were to look at astrology, whether you assign or align to it or not, there is this idea of, and you see this in many areas of philosophy, there is this idea that free will itself does actually exist, but it is something that needs to be exercised. An example of this would be if you look at how the moon does affect so much of the life on Earth. So we do know that even the mating habits of many creatures are aligned to the magnetic pull of the actual moon. But we do know that certain forces that are brought into our lives by different planets can exert an influence. But the idea in astrology, if you were to get deep into the debate of fate versus free will or destiny versus choice, would be that they believe it's both, and that essentially you are to a degree at the whim of these forces until you can learn to understand what's pushing and pulling at you, and you can almost rise above these energies and therefore begin to exercise free will, or we could say not be as predictable. And I bring this into the space because our fears are very, very much the same thing. Until we are able to meet fear differently, we essentially are playing out a very predictable set of circumstances and choices. And therefore, I think it's fair to say that we, to a degree, do not have free will. There's an age-old story with shamanism that involves a little boy walking through a snow-filled wood of high pines. And as he's walking through looking for firewood, and you can feel the white snow crunching under his feet and the breath creating almost like a smoke cloud, he realizes that a wolf is following him. And this, of course, is an adage for his fear, so to be. And what begins to happen in this very long tale is he begins to speed up more and more. And the wolf that was once only interested or only just making himself known or making a suggestion that he could be dangerous, the more the boy begins to react and try to get away from the wolf, essentially, the more the wolf builds up steam and confidence and begins to eventually jog after him. And in this very beautiful, complex shamanic tale, eventually the boy is running at full pace with his heart pounding until he's absolutely exhausted. And he discovers that there are now many wolves following him. And the wolf has howled and called others that they have essentially found prey. And in this beautiful story, eventually the boy, in desperation, completely run out of energy, feeling almost the taste of blood in his throat, turns back and screams at the wolf as the wolf approaches him snarling. And the wolf stops in its tracks and they make eye contact, which is the showdown between yourself and your fears. And the wolf begins to bow and acknowledges him as the alpha, for the lack of a better word. And this is one of the reasons why many of these talks, why I call them the Wolfpack series, because the idea is that we have all these incredible, almost like archetypes within us that can either begin to dominate us or we can learn to actually work with them. There's a very interesting thing. If you begin to speak about fear, most people do not even realize what a big role fear plays in their lives. A lot of people that I have worked with or have known, and including myself, are unable very often to even identify that what they are suffering from is pure fear. It's quite an interesting thing that many people cannot actually quite put their finger on that. And what's quite fascinating is when you look at fear, I want to make a really interesting suggestion. It has been spoken about in Hermetics, in Rosicrucianism, in Gnosticism, in many ancient schools, right up to the Egyptian mystery schools, that there are levels of initiation that the soul takes on. And in fascination, one of the ultimate levels of initiation, according to all of these schools, or dare I say, the final initiation, is the facing of fear itself, is staring the dark wolf in the face. Now, what an interesting thought to contemplate or to even be willing to entertain, because we are not here to spread truth. We're here to learn, to think deeper, and to unfold concepts that truly work for us and that empower us, because what good does a concept have beyond that? And if we're willing to entertain this possibility that the path of fear itself is one of the final initiations of the actual soul, then that leaves us in a very precarious situation indeed. Because what it makes us realize is that people that are riddled with fears and anxieties and panics and neuroses might, in actual fact, not be the weak, lost individuals that they think. They might have decided to reach the level where the soul has to face, I guess you could almost playfully call it, this demon of fear, who, interestingly enough, is the polar opposite in this beautiful spectrum of reality, of love. What we notice when working with people who are riddled with fear and are trying to liberate themselves are a few interesting things that can really help us begin to immediately hack this process. The first thing, in all the extremes of emotions when working with our Wolfpacks, traumas, fears, insecurities, we discover something that is rather odd, and that is in our resistance to wanting to feel something, we feel it more. Now, one immediately might think from a very new age perspective that this has to do with the law of attraction, but in actual fact, it lies in way more ancient law. A very simple way of putting this is, if someone is very afraid of feeling anxious or very uncomfortable or not in a state of flow or acceptance of their anxiety, they begin to resist it or push it down or suppress it. And the great irony of this process is that those that do not wish to feel anxiety feel more anxiety. Those who do not wish to feel lonely feel more lonely. Those who do not wish to feel anger feel more angry. What a bizarre thing. So we tap into something very early on here. A very good friend of mine, Himjay, always says that as shamanic facilitators or healers or shamans or whatever the outside world calls people that work with people like we do, he says essentially we are just plumbers. And all we are trying to do is get the flow going again. And I'm almost suggesting that the emotions that absolutely cripple us are the ones that have no flow. So I think before we move on, we need to get present with the impermanence of emotion. Emotions come and go, although self-created. They are merely passing through. And it is this first piece of knowledge that can really help us when we are feeling something, telling ourselves that this will be impermanent. This will pass if we allow it to, and we don't charge it too much or resist it too much. The second thing that we find when working with extremes of emotion is one of, to me, it almost doubles up on the same conversation. In other words, this is like a sister to the first fact that we've just learned. And that is that many people suffer regarding an emotion, not only because of the resistance that we've discussed or the suppression, but about self-judgment and opinions that they have regarding that particular emotion. And what this causes in an individual is a very complex interference pattern that can eventually almost become a neurological or psychological disorder to a degree, or a form of neurotic disorder is more what I mean. Now, what does that mean exactly? Someone, for instance, that has a serious problem with anger, now we're not even discussing the suppression, might feel so shameful and angry and confused and self-judgment and all sorts of things about their anger, that while they're having this anger, which they're not allowed to passing through themselves, they are also creating a feedback loop. So they suppress, and then there's the circular feedback loop. How I judge myself. An example would be a spiritual person, while they're having an experience, thinking in the background, this is not how a spiritual person behaves. I'm lost, I'm not a good person. And that interference pattern can be really, really complex when it comes to essentially our liberation of bringing all of our lost children home. Or another way of putting that is just integrating all of our aspects together. It truly is only of the human mind that decided that only certain parts of us were godly. I think it was Shakespeare who actually said that only a mind can make something good or bad. And yeah, it's an extraordinary thing to realize in your healing that we need to bring all of these parts of us home. As we continue this journey, where we have decided just for this half an hour or hour to entertain the possibility that your fear-filled life might be an initiation of great mastery, might be that you are further along the path than you actually think, which would be another example of this interference pattern that I speak of. We actually have no essential measuring stick by which to chart our lives. And many of us are so far off about our self-perceptions. So before we can move ahead powerfully, I want to make a very unusual suggestion. And that suggestion is that in working with your own fears and other people's fears, what could seriously help your liberation or your movement towards empowerment would be the understanding that there is essentially, at the end of the day, only one fear. Now, that's a rather complex statement that makes the brain run, but I just want to discuss this for a little while. What we have discovered, and I've just actually read the most magnificent set of documents from neurology, they have discovered in most of the experiments that they've done, realized that emotion does not precede spiritual sensation. I mean, physical sensation. And another way of putting that is we tend to have some sort of sensory input or experience and then translate emotion, which would explain why sometimes you sit and start feeling really hot, uncomfortable, and claustrophobic just before you have an anxiety attack, or you choose to interpret it as anxiety. Now, this is really, really important, because we begin to understand in all the studies that they're doing on fear, that in actual fact, majority of the people are not so much afraid of the thing that they are suggesting is the problem. They are afraid, or let's call it avoiding at all costs, the feeling of helplessness that fear brings into their bodies. And each person has a particular thing that ignites that far more powerfully than anything else. For one person, it could be a spider, another an airplane, another it could be some form of intimacy. But essentially, it brings up this feeling of helplessness. So for us to be able to willing to accept this idea that in actual fact, the fear wolf only emanates in one way and uses many smoke and mirrors to penetrate us. We would have to first give it a tangible archetype. In other words, let's give it a personality so that we can see how true the statement might be. Now, in physicality, let's talk about what fear can actually do. What I can tell you is that one of the greatest mistakes I made in my journey of healing, which continues still, was I underestimated just how powerful fear is, and physiologically, psychologically, and even psychically, what it can actually do to a man. If I had known what I know now, I probably would have saved 10 years of looking under the most unusual, mystical rocks, places, and doctors to understand that the way my reality was bent was by fear alone. So where that leaves us, let's take fear. Now, if I was working with someone, I'd even make them paint it or draw it. But let's talk about, just in case you don't know, or so we can get present to it, what fear can essentially do in our bodies. So one of the first things that fear can do is it can begin to speed up our heart rates. We begin to secrete adrenaline. Our hearts start to beat faster. Interestingly enough, adrenaline alone can have a reality-shifting experience where we almost feel mildly trippy and surreal. The heart beating fast, constriction of breathing or shallow breathing, which can lead to a form of hypoxia. In other words, you're not getting enough oxygen to your brain, which can also make things feel further unreal, almost feel like you're in another reality, or things are smoky, and pressure on the chest, a feeling of not like you're going crazy. These are the psychological aspects, a feeling of absolute dread in the solar plexus, a feeling of feeling ill, a feeling of almost like having acid running through your veins and through your stomach, being dizzy, feeling completely uncomfortable in ways that cannot be explained, but dread, like the most terrifying thing is happening. And this is obviously the extremes of what fear can do to you. It can make you feel absolutely weak, that you have no strength. And those are just some of the emanations of fear in our solar plexus, in our minds, dripping with sweat. Sure, there's so many things that fear can do to us. Now, I want to suggest something, that if all those things fire within us, we feel so absolutely helpless that many of us have created what I call a fear blueprint. And the first time you felt that helpless, your mind stored right in the back, I will not allow this to happen to me again. I will not allow myself to feel this helpless. And this blueprint sits right in the back of our minds, sometimes for decades, sometimes our entire lives. And the purpose of this conversation is for you to empower yourself to the point where you begin to find what your not so surface fears are. And the reason why they're usually slightly below the surface is they are usually something so uncomfortable that you're not willing to look at them directly. That's a fascinating thing. And a little bit later at the end, I will show you how to actually, we even trick people. And I mean that obviously through their own acceptance, but you sometimes even have to trick someone to find what it is that they're unconscious. I don't even think unconscious is the right thing, because they're very able to bring it to the surface. So what essentially happened in a lot of experiments, and I'll get us present to what it is I'm actually suggesting here, they did this thing with a lot of people that had to theorize that they were essentially in a plane crash. And when they had been given the choice between, would you want to go down over the 5-minute period on the airplane and have a small possibility of surviving, or should the airplane just explode? And most people chose the airplane should just explode, even though that meant they had no chance of survival. And what this got us present to, and we've seen many such similar experience, is the reason why most people are so afraid of an airplane crash is the thought of being so helpless for a long period of time until you meet your demise. Why people become terrified of the thought of being locked inside a cupboard or some enclosed space. I want us to get present to why that feeling of helpless terror, the psychological, emotional, and physical aspects firing off within us for a long period of time, which of course is to a large degree how some of the biggest traumas are created. But I want us to just consider this possibility. So I'm actually saying that you are not really afraid of anything in your life. I'm actually suggesting that certain things due to circumstances may be self-created. That's for doctrine. That's not for this conversation. But that there are certain things, whether it is something that happened between you emotionally and your parents, lovers, friends, or whether it was physical dangers, I want to suggest that the things that you have extreme fears of are those things that took you to your blueprint of helplessness, and that your brain is doing everything in its power to not take you back there. And of course, as we know, what we suppress becomes stronger. So we're just going to suggest that just for a second, and I'm going to ask you, even if you don't agree and you're thinking that's not true, I'm definitely scared of something in specific. I want us to just entertain for the last 15 minutes that there is this possibility. What this would actually mean is that if we can learn to allow that emanation of this fear wolf, knowing what its personality and characteristics are like, once we get to the point where we realize that this wolf is all smoke and mirrors, we can learn to stand like a mighty initiate in the face of the storm as fear tears at your very personality and limbs, and even your reality in that moment where it feels like all crumbles, that we can literally stand there and say, is that the best you've got? And that would be the initiation, if you are a fearful person, that you search for in this life. And why this is extremely important is, can you imagine going to a psychologist for 5 years because of your fear of spiders, never realizing that it has nothing to do with the spider, and that essentially it is the helplessness, the creepiness, the physical sensations, the psychological sensations of being helpless that you are in aversion to. And they eventually cured you of your fear of spiders. And you would walk out the door, and not even a week later, you would now be afraid of locusts or aeroplanes, and this is essentially the smoke and mirrors of life. Everyone walking around not realizing, as many of the great artists and poets have expressed, that the only thing to fear is fear itself. The only thing to face is the enormity of fear, and then once is liberated. It's also very interesting to realize that for the most part, the legend goes that the first level of fear that we need to face is our mortality. Many psychologists, including Freud and Jung, spoke about the fact that even when you're screaming at your friend or your lover, angry and scared, that mostly in some ways behind that is our fear of our mortality. Another way of putting that is the fact that we know that our mortal coil will soon end plays into many of our behaviors, which is quite interesting. And if it's true that our fear of death, or the fact that terrifyingly we never get present with this existential dread about the fact that amidst this mystery, which no one can truly explain, we suddenly come to our demise. And it's a magnificent thing to think about that in shamanism, one of the ultimate goals, if there's such a thing, or level, is to face your death, or to experience death long before your physical vehicle switches off, so that you can truly be free. In other words, face your death before you die so that you may live. How magnificent. Now, on the conversation on death, not death, on fear, what becomes fascinating when working with someone who has a very strong neurotic spectrum, it could be anything, it could be schizophrenic, it could be anxiety, it could be panic disorder. What we discuss and what we realize is that fears are essentially separated into two areas. You get tangible fears and intangible fears. And tangible fears are quite self-explanatory. If you've been in a car accident, you'll be terrified of being in a car for a period or possibly your whole life. You will have fears of certain things, insects, it could be intimacies, but they're tangible because you're able to essentially maybe not understand why you have it, but the fear itself is something that can be expressed. Intangible fears are where things get really interesting. Intangible fears are things that are ethereal, that are essentially unknown, are part of the mystery, beyond physical. And of course, those fears are far more complicated to treat because they cannot be proven to be right or to be wrong. And as most therapists will tell you, it's very hard to be logical around that conversation, essentially. The incredible thing to note that for the majority of people, when their body goes into some form of fear spectrum or panic, the brain begins to search in desperation for some explanation that could put into context what could possibly be happening to that person. And for the majority of people, the basement or the ceiling, the extreme of that would be the thought, I am dying, as we've discussed. And many people who have had a panic attack, or many people that have rushed themselves to hospital, will know this to be true. Where psychosis gets very interesting, or where things get even further, is that for the most part, people that tend to suffer from even further or more complex neurotic or psychotic or spiritual disorders tend to be extremely open-minded. And it's quite fascinating to realize that essentially what happens with some of them is if these episodes continue, and I'm just remember the extremes of what these things feel like, that they often begin to search for otherworldly explanations. And in these otherworldly explanations, there's some very common ones, like something is interfering with me, something's attacking my soul, I'm not real, I'm losing my mind, and these would be more of the ethereal. And it's quite a fascinating thing because it's known for a very long time that there's an absolute fine line between psychosis and divine, being touched by the divine. Even William Blake, in some of his passages, as he wrote some of the most beautiful pieces of all time, said that sometimes he didn't know if he was more touched by madness than God or more by God than madness. And this is a very interesting thing. And I get asked this by a lot of people who are experiencing shifts in reality and psychosis in states of fear. And for the most part, what I can tell you is that it's a personal belief that when you are touched by the divine, it does not leave you feeling confused, afraid, and essentially lost in the world around you. It's an extraordinary thing to consider. Being open-minded is a magnificent thing and something that surely has a very, very powerful value in life. But what I have experienced is countless people that have got themselves into trouble because without doing the inner work, learning to have peaceful waters within, learning to truly understand that we are amidst the womb of God. In other words, we are in a perfect situation and reality of laws. Now, it sounds so strange, but what I mean is this is the perfect environment where we can learn to create and give and take responsibility, learn to create and learn to take responsibility for our thoughts and our feelings, and our reality reflects us, and we really are in the perfect environment. And unfortunately, there are very, very strong movements in what a lot of people are calling an awakening of people that have so much information at their fingertips, but they are not feeling that safety, not just in their spiritual connection, which would give you a sense of peace and understanding to the corporeal and temporary nature of all things, but also having an extreme access to so much information that would be considered negative. And the results of searching through these realities and through this information, when one does not essentially feel possessed or embodied and safe within one's own flesh chamber, then essentially what happens is we allow psychosis and the possibility of anxiety disorders and spiritual disorders, which is something that I work most with, to become rampant. In other words, you don't feel calm within, and then you start looking into these really, really big, complex systems of negative agendas, and it splits you. It splits you mentally. If you think the system of domination and control are something new, then you really need to start reading and getting into your history. We essentially, no matter what country, no matter what part of history, there has always been a strong system of domination, control, and cruelty to a degree for us to rise above and for us to transcend. What we are going through in our reality nowadays is nothing new. The balance is always there. The cosmic laws are always balancing all. And that's truly my perspective. I always laugh when I always joke about something like this. If you're standing on a street corner and you see this car accident and two people screaming at each other, and then on the corner you see another person crying, and then you see a person listening to music and dancing, then you see two people on the other side of the road kissing, it almost looks like absolute chaos. And it's very hard when we are not centered within our own being, to not understand that we are seeing perfection unfolding, that all things meet all things that are needed to meet. Truth leads itself unto itself. And another way of putting it is that to understand that perfection is framed within chaos, which is framed within perfection, which is framed within chaos. If you were to stand on the ocean in the middle of a mighty storm, would you not think this is chaos? And yet is that ocean not expanding for thousands of kilometers in a perfect symbiosis, in a perfect balanced system, where overall the ocean is in absolute harmony? It just has certain parts expressing certain personalities. If you were to look into infinite space, do not entire stars explode and implode? And yet, if you pull back and look at the enormity of the galaxy, where in a magnification or a focusing on one area, what looked like absolute chaos in the universe, pulling back, one observes how perfectly all the planets and all the stars pull and dance in unison with each other. That is the true reality of nature. There is no chaos. And if you wish to, without first having that inner balance within you, to explore the chaotic sides of things, then you will become a mouthpiece for chaos, and you will scare many other people, and you will spread the fear within you, thinking that you are essentially a truther. That does not mean that we cannot speak into the negative agendas. That does not mean that we cannot stand for things that we wish to. But it truly is important for us to first be anchored within our own presence. So when it comes to this fear conversation, it gets quite powerful, because I have suggested that you could waste the rest of your life trying to avoid all these complex fears, finding a new one every week, always feeling completely overwhelmed and wondering whether it will ever end, until one day it dawns on you what these mighty writers have been telling us, that there is only one fear, and that it has this archetype that we built. And essentially we go on this hero's journey, where, as they do with the hero's journey, we learn to descend into that darkness, with the idea that one day we will be able to stand there as it rips and tears at our body like a storm of anxiety and go, is this the best you've got? How would this look practically in your life? It could even be being in a car and having a panic attack in traffic, and where we would have to run and solve and cry and freak out. We will get so strong that as it rises and we're sitting there and we feel the biggest panic of our lives, we whisper right at the end, come on, you must have more for me. And it's an incredible thing about that primal aspect of our brains, that once our brain realizes that we are no longer suppressing, that we are calling, fear begins to shrink like a little puppy within us. Quite extraordinary. And don't be fooled. It will be back to try through another mirror, maybe through heights, and maybe through some emotion or intimacy, or to find its way to get you to that helplessness where you forget that all you have to do is embody in that presence. It's a magnificent thing to think how this could change. And you know, the level of fear that you are able to actually essentially face is how much love you are able to embody. If you imagine these bodhisattvas of old, or even of nowadays, fear cannot shake them, and therefore the amount of love that they can hold inside themselves is intangible. So lastly, the tool that I'd like to give you is to try and search for the things that you essentially are afraid of. A very simple story I can tell you of how this process works is I have always had an uncomfortable feeling about suffocating, and how the calling the wolf out process works is as follows. Is what happens is you essentially, instead of avoiding a fear, you want to take that fear on directly. Let me give you a very simple version of this first. Lying in bed because you are so afraid for days and days you can't sleep because someone has said they need to talk to you, and you are so afraid that maybe, for instance, you're going to lose your job and now this meeting's a week down the line. You could either lie there and feel sick with worry. How the process of calling the wolf out is that you would lie there and you would accept the fact that maybe you're going to lose your job, and you would allow all the emotions to rush into you, and you would get to the point where you understand, I do not want this to happen, but if it happens, I can deal with it. And truly, the next week is far calmer. Whereas if you keep avoiding the thought, you terrorize yourself. A very extreme version of this was a little while ago, just before COVID. I have no longer, but I had quite bad asthma, and I had a fear of suffocating. And I had a terrible experience while surfing in the middle of winter, far behind the waves and in deep fog where no one could see me at the back, where I began to battle to breathe, and I could not get back to shore. And there were very few surfers around. And luckily, I made it back that day. But I remember being extremely uncomfortable and scared about this possibility of almost suffocating. And of course, COVID began just after that. And this played in my mind so much that I was having breathing problems, and I was in this anxiety spiral. And I really had this fear of suffocating. And eventually I decided to call out the wolf. And this is such an important process. I lay on the bed and asked myself, what is the worst thing that can happen? What is your ultimate fear? And I realized my ultimate fear was suffocating. And eventually I got strong enough that when I lay on my bed at night in this high anxiety, worrying about COVID and breathing and surfing, that I did this one day. I went, I held my breath. And as I was holding my breath, I asked myself, what is it that you're so afraid of? And I realized it was, once again, which is the shamanic lesson we've learned, it's the sheer panic and helplessness that would happen right at the end. And I decided to hold my breath as long as I could. And eventually I began to feel a little bit weak. And right at the end, the panic started. And it suddenly occurred to me, it would be 15 or 20 seconds panic and it would be completely over. And guess what? I can handle that. And I'm not losing my life about a little bit of discomfort. I am not going to sit in a state of anxiety and panic for the rest of my life about the possibility of 15 quite desperate seconds. And I felt completely liberated. I now surf again. I lost all fear during COVID. And I hope this explains this very powerful process that I'd like you to either come and do with me or to do on your own. Do it on your own. So I would like you to actually sit down and try and find what it is, those fears that you have. And if possible, get to the point, even if it is your husband might leave you, your child might die. You need to get to the point psychologically where you know, this is not what I want, but I do not need to attract any of this to me because I could handle it. It's very, very powerful. And sometimes these fears are so deeply hidden that in sessions, the only way we can get someone, especially the intangible ones, the ones that are actually causing mental disorders, they usually are things that someone cannot verbalize because they sound so stupid. Very few people that have some mental disorder, is a terrible word. I mean, I've had mental disorders my whole life, disorder. In other words, you are not in a good state mentally. There is a lot of fear going on. A lot of these people can't even verbalize it because they don't even know how, because they think it sounds silly. And one of the ways we liberate them is we tell them, okay, let's use our imaginations. So we disconnect them from having to take ownership from it. Tell me about some of the most far out fears you can think of, like give me some extreme ones. And nearly every single time they'll say things like, wow, what if something's controlling me? And as soon as they start saying it, they realize they actually deeply fear that. A very common one is very spiritual people realizing through sessions. Now, this gives you an idea of how it hides in plain sight, that they are terrified that there is no God. They might even be a spiritual teacher. And one day in a state of freaking desperation, in helplessness, a thought crossed their mind, an intangible thought. What if there's no God? And this created a terror so deep in them that every time something spiritually uncomfortable happens, they have an anxiety attack. And this is how we reclaim our lives. We find these intangible fears. We face the tangible fears, as I explained, knowing we can handle it, and we call the untangible or the etherical or the otherworldly fears forward so that we can critically assess them. I hope this is a lot of help. Please follow the channel if you want to. We'll do a lot of talks on things like this. Just click subscribe. Feel free to contact me if you would like to work with me at some stage. But I continue to keep talking on this subject. I lost a big part of my life to absolute fear and terror. And on the other side, I still deal with fear, but on the other side, I find I have a mountain of compassion. I feel a deep understanding of how psychosis and the mind works. And I feel like all the right people are brought to me. And I feel like the deep suffering that I've had was all worth it. And it was just such an honor to spend some time with you guys all in this room. And I really appreciate that you gave me your time.